Hello, everyone. My name is Jean Tiberio, and I'm a nutritionist and a wellness coach. Welcome to Healing Outside the Box. This is episode 204, and I'm calling it, Let's Round Up the Usual Suspects. Again and again. Now, I've just looked over my list of previous podcast episodes, and I noticed that I have at least 5 episodes on Monsanto, GMO seeds that it makes, by the way, and the most famous chemical put out by Monsanto, and that is the herbicide Roundup. So I thought I would do an episode where I just pull out some of the major points that I've made in some of these episodes, because with all the political noise in this country, I think it's still important to hold our attention to food safety issues that are perhaps not getting addressed, because, well, it may come as no surprise to you that one of the many things that President Trump is doing is that he's getting in bed with Monsanto and simultaneously knocking down EPA regulations that would hold Monsanto's feet to the fire. But first, I want to follow up on last week's episode of the importance of laboratory rat studies to ensure food safety. If you haven't listened to that episode, I recommend it because it emphasized the importance of respecting our laboratory rats and the rat studies because they give their lives to save ours. But don't worry, if you're a little queasy about rats, you won't have to be looking at any rats because it's not a video podcast. So there will be no discussion about killing the rats. Although, believe it or not, in the labs we had little baby rat guillotines. But again, I'm not going to go into that. Unless you really want me to. Which I'm sure you don't. Or maybe you do. Anyway, in last week's episode, I mentioned that I worked in the nutrition pathology labs, where the famous hot dog study was conducted. Now, in the hot dog lab, I happened to have a different study going on with my own 360 laboratory rats. And at that time, I was investigating whether a specific food ingredient may or may not cause cancer. The food ingredient was lactase, and it didn't. But I forgot to tell you about my favorite rat story, which actually comes from a lab at college. This is where I was doing my lab study training, because believe it or not, you have to be trained to work with rats. We were dosing the rats with various levels of vitamin A, but that's not important. I was basically training to do rat studies, which, if you're interested, probably not, but I'm going to tell you anyway, involves weighing the rats, dosing the food, and depending on the study, sometimes we simply add it to the food and make the food ourselves. It also involves weighing the food before and after feeding, so you get an accurate picture of how much of the, in this case, vitamin A was taken in. Then it involves killing the rats and doing rat autopsies. And part of this training, as you may have guessed, would be to learn how to handle the rats. Now, rats that are grown in captivity are generally even-tempered, and as I like to say, well-meaning. But if they are cornered or threatened, they will bite. So we were instructed not to quickly thrust our hand into the cage and grab the rat, because that's going to terrify them. But one night, I was late getting to the lab to weigh my rats. It was after 6 p.m. and I was tired and grumpy. I was also the only one in that part of the building, so it was a little strange not to hear any sounds, other than the rats running around, of course. So I wanted to quickly get the weighing over with so I could go home. And at that time, I was a poor student, so I was walking home. Okay, so I am pulling the rats out of the cages to weigh them, and I wasn't paying much attention and just stuck my hand into the cage without looking to see where the rat was. Big mistake. The exact second I saw the rat cowering in the back of the cage was about the same second I felt a sharp pain in my index finger. I quickly pulled out my hand, only to see that the rat was still dangling in mid-air at the end of my finger. He apparently just decided not to let go. In those days, we only wore plastic gloves, like the kind you get at Walgreens, so there was no protection in the case of a rat bite, and he dug in his teeth pretty good. So again, being caught off guard, I freaked out, and before I had time to think about it, I flung the rat like a frisbee across the room. Almost like in slow motion, I watched the rat fly in an arc, and then slowly come down from the arc and hit the wall on the way down. Then he slumped to the floor. Uh-oh, I thought to myself. I looked down at my finger, which had a minor gash, but blood was dripping all over the floor. But first I had to get the rat back in the cage. So I picked up the rat, who wasn't looking too good but was still alive, and put the rat back in the cage, quickly closing the door behind him. I had a feeling I wasn't going to get away with this, since I had no idea what I had done to him, and if the rat was found dead in the morning, I would be the primary suspect. Besides, I knew I would have to get checked out at the clinic on campus, and I did. The next day, it was close to noon by then, I walked into the professor's office with the bandage on my finger and told him the story. His eyes widened and he said, "Is the rat dead? Did you kill it?" I said, "No, the rat survived, and I'm also fine." Now, my fellow students, instead of being sympathetic, which was what I was hoping for the most part, were looking down at my finger and snickering. I couldn't help but think that I was the Rodney Dangerfield of the nutrition department. I learned that this is what proper training is all about. Anyway, back to the episode. I decided to round up all of my previous episodes on Monsanto and listen to them again because I wanted to cherry pick some of the information. Now, I'm sure we are all aware that Monsanto has gotten themselves a bad reputation, and many people out there, including myself, would like there to be a boycott on Roundup. That would be ideal, and I'd like to be optimistic, so I've decided that I'm going to be. By the way, there's a great article in last October's edition of The Guardian that details what has been going on with lawsuits against Monsanto. Right now it seems like data is being collected with warp speed about people who have been exposed to Roundup and have been diagnosed with non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. I'll give you a link to the Guardian article in the show notes. And I applaud journalists who are really paying attention to things like this. Because if one of us gets cancer from Roundup, then that's one too many. Now, for a little background, Monsanto's Roundup is the most widely used weed killer, or herbicide as we say. The active ingredient is glyphosate, which is now declared a known carcinogen, or cancer-causing agent. Yet it is still being sprayed on crops everywhere, and this chemical carcinogen is now found in about 70 to 80% of supermarket products. Not organic products, but general products. All of this business with Roundup and cancer hit the national news because of a key verdict in one of these lawsuits taken out against Monsanto. A man by the name of Dwayne Johnson was a city worker in California whose job it was to spray Roundup on school grounds to get rid of the weeds. He was diagnosed with non-Hodgkin's lymphoma and is now dying. In August of 2018, Dwayne Johnson was awarded $78 million. At the present time, over 8,000 similar cases regarding people using Roundup and getting cancer are presently open before the courts. If you want to read more about Dwayne Johnson's case, I'll give you a link to that in the show notes as well. Now, as I look back on my years doing laboratory rat studies, it makes me sad to think that Monsanto purchased its way into allowing Roundup to be sprayed on school grounds. But it's also sprayed on backyards and most of the crops that become the food we feed our children. And this was without almost any laboratory rat studies. The lab rats would have gotten cancer. We know that now. But to think that dosing the rats with a toxic herbicide so that we might wonder whether it would be okay for us to eat it seems too cruel to even do to the rats. And today you just learned that rats are mostly well-meaning, except when they're threatened. But people would have thought we were crazy if we suggested doing a study on a toxic weed killer for human consumption. But that's where we are. Who would have thought that this herbicide would be in our children's food? Well, it's starting to leak out that Monsanto may have known. But the good news is that the public is now aware, and hopefully we can get this herbicide out of our food and grow natural food again. And the Environmental Working Group is now testing foods for the presence of glyphosate. If only we could get our elected officials to pay attention. Ah, yes, we now have new elected officials, many of them young, many of them mothers. Hope is on the horizon. So what I thought I would do today is to go over some of the points I've made in previous episodes on Monsanto and Roundup. I'll give you the name of the episode and the link in the show notes if you wanted to listen to the entire episode. Okay, back in episode 130, which was entitled, What's Monsanto Been Up To?, I bring up a secret meeting that President Trump had with the CEO of Monsanto and the CEO of Bayer. This happened early in 2017, just 3 days before Trump's inauguration. Now, I find this really interesting. These two men literally slithered into the back door of the Trump Tower in New York. I'm sure they made an interesting threesome, but almost no one noticed. Now, I don't mean to pick on poor President Trump, because the poor little baby has been picked on enough already. It just seemed a little odd at the time. Monsanto and Bayer and Carrot Top. Then, in June of 2018, almost a year and a half later, Monsanto announced that it would be merging with Bayer, a chemical company that's headquartered in Germany. The Monsanto name, and some might say with a negative reputation, would be changed to Bayer. Sometime in the last 2 years, the EPA has been stripping its regulations that might require documents about Roundup and cancer to be part of the public domain. To add insult to that injury, the 2015 report from the World Health Organization, or WHO, declared Roundup to be a known carcinogen. At some point, information leaked that an EPA official promised Monsanto that it would block the follow-up report. So Bayer and Monsanto have merged, and it looks like Dow Chemical and Syngenta might merge. If that happens, these two combined corporations would own 59% of the Earth's seeds. They would also own 64% of the Earth's pesticides. So let's boycott everything with Monsanto on the label. That brings me to episode 167, How to Avoid Monsanto's Food Products. So how are we going to do all this boycotting? The first thing we can do to protest Monsanto is to stop buying Roundup. In this episode, I go through a list of food items that have been discovered to contain Roundup. So it might be worth a listen if you're interested. In this episode, I also discuss the whole issue of activism versus passivism. In other words, we have these wonderful spiritual leaders who are meditating in their monasteries and spreading all that good energy from inside of them to their environment. But if their environment is just a monastery, would it not be more helpful for enlightened people to visit, say, the south side of Chicago? A famous activist and Holocaust survivor by the name of Elie Wiesel talks a lot about activism. Here's one of his famous quotes. Quote, "The opposite of love is not hate, it's indifference." End quote. Here's another quote by him. Quote, "There may be times when we are powerless to prevent injustice, but there must never be a time when we fail to protest." End quote. So in other words, we can be both a pacifist and an activist. And for many reasons, maybe the time is, maybe now, or soon. So when it comes to Monsanto, maybe we can try to buy less of what they're selling. Now, in episode 177, I discuss the whole GMO labeling business. The state of Vermont and my state of Massachusetts both successfully passed GMO labeling laws. And just before Vermont's was about to go into effect, Monsanto spent millions of dollars to block that from happening. And yes, our senators and congressmen allowed that to happen. But if we want GMO labeling, I feel like we shouldn't give up. All we have to do is say to these elected officials, we're not going to elect you, because 93% of Americans want GMO labeling. And that's a pretty good percentage. So it'd be nice if we could hold up our signs and make that happen. Now, in episode 151, I go over the fact that 70 to 80% of foods in the supermarket are now being sprayed with Roundup, again, which contains glyphosate. But I also discuss a new chemical on the market called dicamba. This is a new weed killer, again put out by Monsanto, and it's putting new weed killers on the market because, lo and behold, weeds are getting resistant to Roundup. And in this episode, I go over the evidence that Roundup has been linked to birth defects, respiratory illnesses, DNA damage in adults, leaky gut, and non-alcoholic fatty liver. So those are the past episodes where I talk about Roundup. More recently, I've read a few articles that say that Roundup not only kills plants, scientists now agree that it damages human cells and results in an increased risk of cancer. Now, this Roundup has been around for 30 years with very little rat studies or people studies. So why is the link to cancer so obvious now? It's because Roundup is now being used, as I said before, in 70 to 80% of the foods we consume. And the doses that are being sprayed on crops are now much higher because of the whole resistance thing. And we also have better testing techniques. One article I read said that levels of glyphosate, the active ingredient in Roundup that causes the cancer, has now increased as much as 1,300% in people's bodies. Glyphosate used to be used only in corn and soy, but now it's used in just about everything, and they allowed Monsanto to spray it on wheat before harvesting. So it's not being sprayed on the soil, it's being sprayed on what we're about to eat. Glyphosate has been found, obviously, in root vegetables, almonds, beet sugar, canola oil, in most fruits. 30 popular cereals also contain Roundup, according to the Environmental Working Group. The vast majority of chemicals, like glyphosate, will never be adequately tested in rats or in people. Our government doesn't have the resources, and of course companies don't have the incentive. So what can we do? Well, I've hinted at this before, but number one, we can boycott Monsanto where we know it exists. Here's a quote from Erin Brockovich. Quote, "Many people are looking for a simple answer or new insight into the issue, but the answer has always been the same. We need to petition our legislators, exercise our right to vote, rally our communities, and that includes pushing community gardens and farmers markets, lobby for what we believe in, and most importantly, understand that it's the health and welfare of our families that is at stake." End quote. I know it's maybe just human nature, and we're all human, but I think we secretly hope that people like Erin will do the heavy lifting for us. But here's another way to look at it. We have a feeling of accomplishment if we do something positive to help our community and our planet. Now, the second thing we can do, as much as humanly possible, is to consume organic products. I know the cost is higher, but in my opinion, the cost of getting cancer, both in dollars and in suffering and in emotional pain, is much greater. Keep in mind that in order for a product to be labeled organic, the plants and the soil need to be certified organic. The seeds need to be non-GMO and organic as well. And because Monsanto owns the GMO seeds, we can kill two birds with one stone, since this will hurt Monsanto's business. We can use our schools, which are public property, to grow healthy food. We can teach our school children to cook their own organic lunches, grow their own food in the schoolyard, and perhaps most importantly, understand the importance of healthy food to our bodies and minds. And here's what I'd like to say. We all win when we improve the health and well-being of our kids and ourselves. and we make cancer once again a rare commodity. That's all I have for you today. Be well and stay tuned next week for another episode of Healing Outside the Box.